I'm going to make a couple of assumptions too that I'll lay out as I'm introducing my thoughts on this. I really started thinking about this in a new way last fall when Secretary of Defense Robert Gates spoke at Duke. And he spoke on September 29th. And I was struck by the fact that here was a Secretary of Defense who had been a Secretary of Defense in a Republican administration, is now a Secretary of Defense in a Democratic administration. He has overseen two largely unpopular wars. One that, you know, the Iraq War maybe is officially over, but isn't really. In fact, Gates just yesterday said we might increase the number of troops that are going to be left there, if in fact that's what the Iraqis want. So there are two very unpopular wars, and the Secretary of Defense spoke here, and there was not a single Duke student who protested his appearance. And I think that's not a single one. And I've asked people, I wasn't there, I've looked at the record, I've asked, not a single, and I'm not presupposing what one's view on the war should be, but there's probably some people here who think one of those two wars is not advisable, if not both. And there was nothing. And even more interesting to me were Gates's comments, where he said, where he called on Duke students to enroll in the military. And he said, and I quote, "If America's best and brightest people will not step forward, who then will step forward?" He called on students in the audience and other leading schools to, quote, "go outside their comfort zones and take a risk in every sense of the word." That's kind of the Duke Engaged tagline, take a risk, which is interesting in a different way. With a gun, take a risk with a gun. There's three anecdotes, that's the first. The second is my colleague Dunford Peck called me on election day, or the day before election day, and he said, the day before election day, and I had some contact with him before, basically saying, can't we get the university to pay for a bus to get students to polling places? Eric, do you realize how much you're spending on Duke Engage? And it would cost us maybe $1,000. He said, I'm going to write something in the Chronicle about this, and I want you to know it. And I really appreciated your the heads up, and I got to thinking, well, that's kind of interesting. And you know, some sense, and Gunther, you might know this better than I do, that the general turnout of Duke students in the last election was quite high, but that has historically not been very high. And national trends actually show that the youth turned out in great numbers for the 2008 campaign. That's already declining in state elections, and there's not much hope that we're going to hold on to that youth involvement. So that was the second anecdote. And then the third was, I was at a conference this weekend in Washington where a colleague of mine who runs a very large civic engagement center at an Ivy League school that's very deeply involved in its local community, he's been at this for a long time. He's one of, I'm not going to use his name because I don't know, I didn't ask him if I can share his off the record comment. But he basically said, you know, I used to be kind of a leftist and a radical, and then I got into this business, and I don't talk about my politics anymore. I'm running a civic engagement center that's deeply involved in the schools in my community, and I'm talking to very big donors, and I'm talking to the president of the university. I just heard from a member of the Board of Trustees of Teach for America that 16% of Duke of seniors applied to Teach for America this year. 16% of the seniors. And that was just confirmed in a conversation I had with the head of the Career Center. So we are active, I think, in a moral sense and in an intellectual sense in natural disasters around the world. I'm always very proud of Duke University and students, faculty, and staff. When Katrina hit New Orleans, the tsunami, I remember feeling deeply proud and touched when I was walking across campus after my house course one night, and there was a group of students in front of the chapel who were organizing around getting support for the victims of the floods in Pakistan. And so you can walk around campus and see that all the time. And that's, I think, a really good thing. So the question for me is not so much whether we're engaged, but what kind of engagement that we're involved in. There's also a normative argument here, and I'm just going to make an assumption. You know, you can get away with a lot when you make assumptions. And I'm going to do that just for the purposes of our conversation. Do we have any economists in the room? Okay, so I can tell this little story about the kind of assumptions economists make. Some of you probably heard this story, but there's a biologist, a physicist, an economist. They're stuck on a desert island, and they've been there a long time, and they have a can of tuna fish, and they have to open it, and the chemist says, well, I think what we should do is put it in the ocean and let it oxidize, and that's about as much as I know about chemistry, and it will open. They said, well, no, that'll take 100 years, we can't do that. The physicist said, well, I'm going to go to the top of a tree, I'm going to sit in the tree, I'm going to drop the can of tuna fish on a rock, it's going to open up and we'll be able to eat it. And they said, well, no, the tuna fish will get all over the place, we won't be able to eat it. And then the economist says, I know. First, let's assume we have a can opener. Thus, the point of the story being, you can assume away a lot of problems by getting rid of some of the difficult considerations. So I want to assume that we are going to agree as a group for now, and we can talk about whether this assumption is a good one or a bad one, that political engagement and civic engagement are good things. That normatively, we think our students should be involved in these things, that we think citizens in general should be involved in these kinds of things. What are these kinds of things? I want to differentiate between political engagement and civic engagement. We have a lot of different definitions of these, but I'm going to use one that I borrow from a really fascinating book on this called A New Engagement, Political Participation, Civic Life, and the Changing American Citizen, which focuses on a lot of these issues. And so, so political engagement is everything from the easiest form of political engagement is probably registering to vote, and there's a continuum, and you can see that then you would vote as something that's a little more demanding than registering to vote. And then, of course, there'd be writing letters, working for candidates, but things within the public political realm. For civic engagement, we have a lot of definitions. We've been talking about this a lot at Duke. I'm just going to use a very practical one for these purposes, and that practical one is civic engagement is defined as organized voluntary activity that focuses on problem solving and helping others. Okay? Civic engagement defined as organized voluntary activity that focuses on problem solving and helping others. It's not a very rich definition, but it's practical for my purposes. And so what we know in general, to paint with the broadest brush about, I'm talking about college students here, not just Duke students, is that the, whatever you call, there's all these different names for this generation, right? The .NET generation. Someone just told me that now the generation born after 9/11 is now called the Homelanders. Was that in a conversation?
That was at PACE last week.
That was at PACE last week, that's right. So there's a whole variety. But the youth in general are more active civically than their counterparts, older people, and they are less active politically. Okay, and that's empirically true, and of course you can disaggregate that in a whole variety of ways, but in general, that holds. So a couple of, and voluntarism is at a historical high amongst youth and amongst our Duke students across, whether it's tutoring in public schools, taking part in Duke Engage, all the variety of ways that students get involved. So there's a divide. There's definitely a divide between political engagement and civic engagement. So when I think about college campuses, I have a couple of observations to make. One is historically, and Bob will talk more about this in his comments that follow mine, we have been leaders in political activity. And so I actually just serendipitously last night, my son is doing a project in 8th grade on comparing the protests against the Vietnam War to protests against the Iraq War. He's having trouble finding the protests against the latter. But was watching a movie called The War at Home, which focuses on the University of Wisconsin. And it's an amazing film about the activism of college students that went from peaceful protest to blowing up the math building when they found out they were taking part in some secret. I should also say that I think there are many programs in civic engagement here at Duke. I think the Heart Leadership Program does a very good job of this, of linking the civic to the political. It's not impossible. I don't think we often do a very good job of it, but they're not mutually exclusive, and it's certainly possible that that you can do both. What I'll say in closing, just kind of to put out this question, is to ask, does this divide between political and civic engagement matter? And I want to say, well, obviously I think it does. I wouldn't have organized this conversation. I actually think it's very important. I think that if the youth of this country reject politics
in the way that they seem to be rejecting politics with a blip around the Obama, and actually the Kerry election a little bit statistically. What are the implications of youth of this country being pushed away from the political world? And another way to think about it is, we're growing up in an age where even politicians, and whether you're left or right, Democrat, Republican, even politicians run against politicians and run against the political system. No matter which side you're on. Obama ran against the system. McCain ran against the system. He did. It's kind of hard to, he's been in the system 30 years. People run against the system. And so are the youth, are our college students, are our Duke students responding rationally to a political system that is simply deeply broken? And they say, you know what, I'm taking my energies elsewhere. I don't trust the government, it's ineffective, it's inefficient, and I don't think they're going to do anything to help tutor children, to use that metaphor again. So it may in fact be that the disparity between political and civic engagement amongst our youth is not irrational, but is instead a symptom of something much broader that I think we all should be concerned about for those of us who believe in democratic participation. So those are my thoughts on this topic, and I think Bob is going to comment next, and then Robin and Gunther will follow.